And it looks like we have attendees, webinar participants who are joining us quickly. I want to welcome all of the webinar participants to the First Monday's evening event today. We're really glad to have you here. And for all of you who watched this event after the fact, a recording, thank you as well for participating in this really lively discussion and listening. I'm Teresa Trahar, and I serve as a faculty member at Dordt University and also as the Dean for Curriculum and Instruction. And I am honored to introduce Kristin to you this evening. She led a lively lecture this morning with some conversation afterwards, and a lot of the student participants had a chance to hear about her thoughts and ideas about American Christian evangelicals and some of the ways that she has been charting the course historically and helping us to think into the future as many of our students anticipate leaving Dordt to serve with their hands and hearts in God's world. I want to take a moment just to introduce Kristin to you. She is currently Professor of History and Gender Studies at Calvin University. She holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame, and she'll be sharing with us her journey from her time here at Dordt through Notre Dame and then today. She has written for lots of really interesting publications, including the Washington Post and Christianity Today, done numerous interviews, including for NPR and CNN, and written 2 books. And tonight she's going to share with us some of the research that she did, in particular connected to one of those books. And this morning she shared some of the work that she's done with her newest book, Jesus and John Wayne. And this evening, Kristin will be presenting a lecture. She recorded the lecture before, so we'll have a chance to listen to that lecture. And then after the lecture is concluded, we will invite questions from webinar participants and hope to have a really lively live discussion about some of the ideas that Kristin presents. Kristin, thank you so much for being here in this rather unusual way during this time of COVID.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all so much. And thank you to Dordt for hosting me for this event. It's a pleasure to be with you remotely and if not in person. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation tonight.
So without further ado, sit back, and Kristin's lecture is titled Christianity and Feminism, A Tangled History. Enjoy.
I wanted to talk today about the relationship between Christianity and feminism in American history. Now, some people say that all history is autobiographical. I'm not sure that that's the case, but for me, that is absolutely true. My historical work comes out of my attempts to make sense of my own experiences of my own life. And that's very much the case for my first book, A History of Christian Feminism. Now, when I grew up, I didn't hear much about feminism. I didn't know much about feminism. I have one murky memory, and it's from when I was quite young. So I'm hoping I didn't somehow invent this memory, but I'm going to go with it for our purposes. I remember asking my mom one time what stop ERA meant. And for those of you older than me, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. I must have seen somewhere a little button that said Stop ERA on it. ERA, of course, the Equal Rights Amendment. The women's rights movement was trying to get that ratified in the late 1970s. By the early 80s, it was clearly going down in defeat. And I was curious, what is the ERA and why do we need to stop it? And I'm not sure exactly what my mom said, but I remember being really confused because I got the impression that, well, first I heard ERA is equal rights for women, which to be honest sounded like a pretty good idea. I was sandwiched in between 2 brothers and I was all for equal rights. But I also got the distinct impression that it wasn't a great thing, and I just wasn't able to sort that out and make sense of that. Apart from that, any kind of women's issues, in my experience, were pretty much limited to the question of women in office. Should women be ordained ministers, elders, and deacons? And that didn't seem to have a lot of bearing on my own life. I went to college, went to Dort, and there I learned all kinds of things, but not much about feminism, not much about women's history at all. In fact, I don't think I read any book that covered women's history to any extent. So it wasn't until I got to graduate school that I started to kind of sort things out. One of the first kind of memories that comes to mind when I got to graduate school was sitting in a seminar class, incredibly nervous about making a good impression, coming from this little school. How was I going to measure up? And I was in a class with all men, and including the professor. And at one point he turned to me and said, "Kristin, can you give us the feminist perspective on this issue, whatever issue we were talking about?" And I just froze. And I thought, I know nothing about feminism. I didn't consider myself a feminist at all. So I kind of fumbled and I said, well, I can't give you the feminist perspective. I can give you a woman's perspective. And then I took a stab at the question. And of course, he immediately pulled back and said, "Oh, of course not. Of course not. I'm so sorry. There are multiple feminisms." And, he really missed the point that I knew next to nothing about feminism and certainly wasn't equipped to give him the feminist perspective on anything. But as I continued my studies at Notre Dame, I began to study women's history. I began to read about the lives of women throughout American history, and what I learned there both surprised me and inspired me. I was surprised or first inspired by the stories that I read. I was inspired by how hard so many women had worked to achieve rights, basic rights, to achieve greater opportunities, the very opportunities and rights that I had always taken for granted. And I saw how those were not given freely, that countless women had devoted their lives, struggled to achieve those rights. And so I was inspired by that. I was also surprised to discover that many of the women who had been on the forefront of the women's rights movement at various times in American history were Christian women. And I had somehow grown up with the idea that Christianity and feminism were incompatible, or at best, there were very real tensions between the two. And so I began to devote myself to a study of Christianity and feminism in American history to try to figure out what had happened and to make sense of my own experiences as well. So very quickly, I came across some earlier work that had been written, actually by Christian feminists themselves, who celebrated many of the women that I had encountered in my coursework as well, Christians who are also feminists. And the majority of these stories they found in the 19th century. And so they're inspiring stories about Christian women working for women's suffrage, working as part of the larger women's rights movement. And these stories are important and they still hold up today. But I found myself increasingly frustrated at the same time because a lot changes from the 19th century to the present, both in terms of women's history, women's experience, and the history of feminism, but also the history of American Christianity. And so on the one hand, these stories could show us that, yes, it was possible to be a Christian and a feminist, but they didn't tell us much about what has happened since that time and how it has in fact become a lot more complicated because of the way that both Christianity and feminism have changed over the last 1.5 centuries. So I began my quest for a topic that would help me to explore kind of this tangled history. And women's history can be a challenge, and particularly women in the history of Christianity, because historians need sources. And to have sources survive into the present, first they had to be produced. So women had to think that what they had to say was worth writing down. worth publishing, had to find a publisher, and then they needed to have a place to keep those writings and have future generations deem them worth keeping, worth saving. And for many women, this simply wasn't the case. So there's the problem of source material. It's always a challenge in doing women's history. Um, I ended up looking, following all sorts of rabbit trails, dead ends, and it was a footnote to a footnote, I think, that led me to a book by a woman named Catherine Bushnell, and that book was God's Word to Women. And I was able to get a facsimile copy of this book uh, when I was in graduate school still. And I remember sitting in my little apartment in South Bend, Indiana, no air conditioning, secondhand couches, and I cracked open this book and I started reading, and I could not believe what I was reading. It was this amazing and amazingly detailed Christian feminism, verse by verse analysis of biblical texts, and coming out with radically different interpretations than any that I had ever grown up with. And it just blew my mind. And immediately I had two questions. Is this for real? And why have I never heard of her before? And why have I never read any of this before? Now, this was in the very early days of the internet, and so there was no Google to do a quick search. I had to start investigating. I found that the Notre Dame Library actually had an original copy of her book, so at least I could say, yes, this book is legit. And it dated first edition to 1916 and later to 1923, revised edition. So I knew it was a historical artifact, and I could deal with it on those terms. Why had I never heard about it before? That was one of my motivating questions. And so I set out to learn everything I could about the author, about Catherine Bushnell. And that project became my dissertation and eventually became my first book, A New Gospel for Women, Catherine Bushnell and the Challenge of Christian Feminism. So what did I learn about Catherine Bushnell? She was born in the middle of the 19th century, and she ended up moving to Evanston, Illinois. She was a devout Methodist, and that was a kind of Methodist enclave. And she grew up in the shadow of Northwestern University and was mentored by Frances Willard, who was one of the most prominent women of the 20th century, or the 19th century. And she became she wasn't as well known when she first met Kate Bushnell, but in a few years from that time, she would go on to lead the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the largest women's organization of the century, and so extremely well placed. Initially, Bushnell studied classical languages, which would come in handy later, and then she switched to the study of medicine. And the women in her Methodist church convinced her upon her graduation from medical school, and she was an early pioneer in terms of women's medical training. They convinced her not to set up a practice in the States, but instead to become a missionary to China. That's kind of what enterprising young women did at that time. And so she spent 2 years in China. 2 very difficult years before returning to the United States. But there was one incredibly formative experience that she had at that point. She was teaching herself Chinese, and she was doing so by reading the Chinese scriptures. She knew the English scriptures intimately well, and so she was practicing Chinese by reading the Chinese translation. When she came across a passage that struck her as wrong. It was a rather obscure passage in the New Testament where Paul is talking about 2 of his helpers, and the Chinese translation had switched these from women, as they are in the English translation, to men, just changed their gender. And she's trying to learn the language and is wondering what's happening, and so she brings it to a male missionary with her in China and says, explain this to me. What's going on here? Am I getting this wrong? And he said, oh, this is undoubtedly because of the Chinese prejudice against women in leadership. And he just brushed it off. And to Bushnell, this was a shocking revelation. How could anybody tamper with the Holy Scriptures. And it didn't take her long to start wondering if a male missionary could be so nonchalant about distorting the scriptures in a Chinese translation. What had other men done through the years, through the centuries, when it came to translating the scriptures, including the English scriptures? And so that was a formative experience. We'll return to that. She goes back to the United States and ends up setting up medical practice in Denver, Colorado, where very soon she comes into contact with prostitutes who are working in the mining towns. And before long, she ends up reconnecting with Frances Willard, who by now is the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Quick word, temperance sounds like a very prudish cause, right? Abstaining from alcohol, at least from our 21st century vantage point. In the 19th century, that was right at the heart of the women's movement because women had very little power. They had virtually no power, economic power, political power. And for women trapped in marriages where the man would go spend the day at the saloon, drink away his wages, come home drunk, maybe beat her, beat their children, she had no recourse. And so temperance became really a women's movement in order to protect women and empower women by removing alcohol from the equation. So Bushnell ends up working with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, but primarily in a new direction, something called social purity, which was simply a Victorian euphemism for sexual purity. She wanted to work to help prostitutes, to help reform prostitutes. And this was a very controversial cause. This was the Victorian era again. And there was a reigning sexual double standard. The idea that, men will be men, and you can't expect a lot of sexual restraint from men. You just have to kind of, make the best of things. Women, on the other hand, that's where all society's morality needed to be protected, needed to be housed. And so women needed to be extremely innocent, pure, society's purity, society's morality really depended on the purity of the woman. And prostitutes then were fallen women. They actually played an important role in kind of addressing this imbalance, because if you have all these really pure women and then lustful men, you need a kind of outlet, and that's what the role that prostitutes played. But by doing so, they were deemed impure and not true women and beyond redemption. For Bushnell, as a devout Christian, she said no person and no woman is beyond redemption. So she started working with prostitutes. Not long after that, she was actually brought to Chicago, to the Midwest, and then hired by the Women's Christian Temperance Union to do an investigation into rumors of prostitution and abuses of women throughout the lumber camps in northern Wisconsin and Michigan. Man had been appointed to investigate, and he came up with nothing. And meanwhile, newspapers were filled with stories of lurid details about women being trafficked and coerced into prostitution, and horrific stories of stockades and guard dogs. And so Catherine Bushnell set out to investigate. She spent 4 months, interviewed more than 500 women, and she found some cases of coercion, but she concluded that far worse and far more common was a different kind of coercion. It was the fact that women themselves had been trapped into this life because of the judgment of others and because of the society around them, that they were deemed not worthy of protection, that their rights had been stripped away. And it was largely respectable women and men in the surrounding communities that were perpetuating essentially this violence against women. And that's what was so shocking to Bushnell. She came across time and again respectable Christian men who were visiting these prostitutes, who were medical doctors, who were treating the prostitutes and making money off of the brothels in their town. Even Christian ministers who said, oh, this is fine, right? Those are the fallen women and they protect the virtue of the true women, and this is just the way it works. This was not acceptable to Bushnell. She published the results of her investigation and it got national attention. This then led to an invitation to essentially do the same thing but overseas. And she was hired to do an investigation in the British Empire, in British India in particular, where the British Army was actually setting up brothels and bringing in Indian women to service the British military men. And they were not supposed to be doing that. Laws had been passed, reformers had been working on this, but they suspected that these practices persisted. So Bushnell was brought in. And once again, she detailed, and we have her journals and we have her maps, and we can see thousands of miles she traveled in colonial India and took meticulous notes and found that absolutely the British military was essentially enslaving Indian women. And once again, she discovered that these were respectable Christian gentlemen. And here it was even more radical what she was encountering, because this was in the late 19th century. This was in the 1880s, when the idea was that Western civilized Christian countries would go civilize the world. And instead what she saw was Western Christian civilized men were abusing women with no consequence. And so she ended up doing this kind of international expose of those conditions. Got a lot of attention. But not long after, a year or two later, she went back to India and discovered that things were exactly back to where they had been. And this led her to a moment of crisis. And she writes about this in a letter to another reformer. This letter is housed in an archive folder in London. And she concludes that all of these instances of respectable Christian men who are perpetrating abuses, horrific abuses against women, she has to finally conclude that these are not just bad apples, that the crime, as she puts it, is the fruit of the theology. And so she returns to her study of the scriptures. Building on her background in classics, she teaches herself Hebrew in addition, and she starts to examine the scriptures. And very quickly, reminiscent of what she had seen years earlier in China, she encountered multiple cases where translators had simply translated passages incorrectly, where a word would be translated one way when it applied to any man, and another way entirely when it applied to women. So when it applied to a man, it would be strength and army and power, and when it applied to a woman, it would be changed to chastity or virtue. Again, she was seeing this is where the sexual double standard has come from. It has been written into the scriptures, but that's not the word of God. And so she spent 2 decades writing, studying. She started a correspondence course for women. She started publishing in the Journal of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and eventually came out with her book, God's Word to Women. And it is a radical rereading of the scriptures based on her novel translations, her retranslations, and her reinterpretations based on those. And I don't have time to go into all of the details, but let me tell you, it's worth taking a look. Actually, her own book was sorely in need of an editor. It emerged from a series of correspondence courses, and so there's a lot of repetition. It's not an easy read. So what I did in my own book is I devote 2.5 chapters to just kind of the greatest hits of her revisionist theology. She published this in early version in the UK in 1916. She had to come back to the United States during the First World War, and kind of the edition that stands today was published in 1923. So what happened? What happened to her? It was a remarkable theology, and she absolutely adhered to the authority of the scriptures. By the 1920s, when this edition was published, it's right in the middle of the fundamentalist modernist controversies, liberal Protestants versus conservative Protestants. She staunchly identified as a fundamentalist, as a conservative who absolutely upheld the authority of the scriptures. But that conservatism did not extend to gender roles, to questions of male headship. And it was the question of male headship in particular that struck her as important. All those years ago, when she was sitting in India struggling to come to terms with how to understand what she was seeing in front of her, she ended up focusing on precisely this question: male headship, which had been taught for centuries by male theologians as God's will. And when she took a look at those texts, she began to understand, first of all, there were some translation issues, but also she understood that at the heart of the Christian gospel was Christ, and Christ's model, which was to not to claim power, but to divest himself of power, to offer himself as a sacrifice. And that is the revolutionary nature of the Christian gospel, she said. So why? Why would men who are seeking to follow Christ end up claiming power over another and claiming power over women? That to her was a fundamental contradiction. Again, she provides all kinds of textual evidence and an extended treatise, 300 some pages, but that really is the heart of her critique. What happens to the book? It goes largely unnoticed. It does get a number of reviews, including from conservative theologians, including from Moody Bible Institute. And I was shocked to see that these conservative reviewers, although they said, okay, we may not agree with her on every point that she makes, she made some really radical ones, including it's not Eve that causes the fall into sin, it's Adam. Amazing, her interpretation of that. And in fact, the Apostle Paul would agree with her. For that, you'll have to look to the book. And I actually open my book with a couple of pages rewriting the first 3 chapters of Genesis based on Catherine Bushnell. But she ends up getting largely affirmed by many of these conservative theologians who say, yeah, we might not agree with every point she makes, but we have to concede that her methods are rigorous. She has the utmost respect for biblical authority, which to them was the critical issue in the 1920s. And they said, honestly, her interpretations are as reasonable as our own, even though they were radically different. So what happened to the book after the initial relatively positive, actually quite positive reception? It really just disappeared. And I had to struggle to understand this. It's one thing to talk about something that's important, that garners national or international news as a historian. It's harder to explain absence. And what I came to see is that by the time she actually published her book, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was still around, but it wasn't the powerhouse it had been 20, 30 years earlier when she was most active in it. She wasn't a professor at a seminary, right? She self-published. She didn't have access to a publisher and the promotion. And more importantly, I think the divisions within American Protestantism by that time meant that the people who were most interested in this meticulous theological work that she had done, conservative Protestants, were not very interested in her feminist theology. Meanwhile, more progressive Christians had kind of moved on. They were using higher scholarship, and they weren't as concerned about the nitty-gritty details of the biblical text. And she absolutely identified again as a fundamentalist when it came to biblical hermeneutics. And so she kind of fell between these two camps. She also ended up out of step with modern feminism, because while a lot had changed within American Christianity over the course of her lifetime, a lot had also changed within the American women's movement. Back in the 19th century, when Bushnell started her work, feminists and Christians alike, Christians like Bushnell, had identified this sexual double standard as a huge, huge problem for women. And at that point, most agreed that the best way to bring things into balance, to rectify this inequality, was not by encouraging sexual liberation from women, it was by encouraging restraint from men. Women were so constrained politically, economically, and they couldn't undo all of that. And so they really thought, if we can just focus on increasing the morality among men, then that will improve the lives of so many women. And so sexual restraint was something that feminist women, sexual restraint for men in particular, and Christian women could unite behind. And that's where we have this kind of golden age of Christian feminism, if you will, in the late 19th century. By the 1920s, the women's movement had decided to take a different tack. A lot of time had passed. They hadn't made much headway with kind of getting rid of that sexual double standard. They hadn't been able to really improve the morals of many American men. And so they said, you know what, let's try the opposite. Let's try to enhance liberation for women. And that's where we have the era of the flappers, the first sexual revolution. And many Christian women like Bushnell, were very skeptical of this. They understood that if you don't change the underlying structures, then there is no liberation for women to be found merely in sexual liberation. That said, many women in Bushnell's circle, including many female pastors, also weren't that alarmed by this seeming decline in morals among the younger generation, the flappers, wearing lipstick and shorter skirts. And they said, you know what, girls today aren't any worse than girls were in our day. And moreover, the Victorian morality, the Victorian moral system that they were rejecting was in fact profoundly immoral, precisely because of the sexual double standard, for the abuses that it allowed to be perpetuated against women. And so it's this remarkable moment. Unfortunately, the voices of those women, of women like Bushnell and many others like her, have largely been lost to history. And I think one of the projects that we can all participate in is kind of rethinking this critical history, this relationship between Christianity and feminism, understanding that things are very complicated, that things change over time, and to try to listen to the voices of people like Bushnell and many women like her, many Christian women who were trying to achieve truly Christian feminism, based on biblical principles, but based on a deep understanding of the Bible, and rejecting patriarchal distortions and misogynistic distortions that had worked their way into the text, doing that meticulous theological work, but then also taking a very critical eye on what passed for Christian morality at the time, and while at the same time having a place to stand to critique a more secular approach to feminism. And so, again, the voices of these women have largely been lost to history, but there are so many women like Bushnell, and by recovering their voices, I think we can both complicate our understanding of the present and possibly enable ourselves to have much more productive conversations in our own time around incredibly important issues and divisive issues today.
So, Kristin, if we were all together in a room in person, I can imagine right now, and maybe you can imagine some applause. So we'll all imagine applause in our mind's eye. Thank you so much for so succinctly but so richly sharing that work that you spent long hours in your apartment and traveling and crafting those words. And I really appreciate the challenge at the end, how you challenge us to complicate our understanding, to listen for voices that have been not heard for a long time, and then how to also think forward into some of these really challenging conversations that face us in our world today. And I think you did that with your talk this morning, and this talk this evening does the same thing. It's challenging us, I think, to take this history and then make it real in our lives today. I'll start with a question, and while we chat for a minute, I'll invite webinar participants. If you have questions for Kristin, comments, things that you'd like her to talk a little bit more about, please put those in the chat. We would love to interact with you and get a sense of some questions. So Kristin, I'll just sort of get things started while folks are wrapping their minds around some questions. I'm wondering now, with the distance of a little bit of time, so first book and then the second book, as you think about these projects, what is the most interesting aspect of these projects now that some time has passed? Something that is sticking with you, maybe from conversations that you've had with people who've read those two books.
Yeah, I think first I wasn't even aware of it, but if you've heard both of my talks, I come down to this at the heart of each project is really this question of power, right? And this question of what is a biblical model of power? What is the model of power that Christ presents us with, right? And it is divesting of power and not grasping at power. And I didn't even realize that until like well into my second book, that I think that, this book on Catherine Bushnell just gave me eyes to see the topics that are really, that I grapple with in Jesus and John Wayne. And so, I can kind of see the development. I've actually written a little piece where I trace the development between that earlier work and then Jesus and John Wayne. I'll also say that, I love the popular reception of Jesus and John Wayne has been really overwhelming, and obviously it speaks into this current political moment, and it was published with a trade publisher, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. But I still feel a little bit like, Catherine Bushnell deserves a hearing, and that so much of the work that we historians do is, digging in the archives. It's I spent a decade on that first book, from the beginning of my dissertation research to when it was published, and that there's just so many kind of hidden stories that we are uncovering and that are worth hearing. And so, yeah, I definitely have a place in my heart for Bushnell's story and for the work that so many historians are doing, especially historians of women and historians of Christian women, to really, spend years or decades to recover these voices, to bring them into our Christian tradition, right? Because they've been largely absent. And that doesn't mean that they're all right or that they're all, equally worth hearing or equally speak into our issues today, but just to have them part of our understanding of Christian history, and then to be able to kind of play around with that and engage that, I think is a huge contribution.
So we have some questions that are being posed by folks in webinar participants, and we'll start with a few questions perhaps around the topic of gender roles. One of the webinar participants is wondering if you could explore a little bit further the idea of gender roles, and are gender roles worth trying to preserve?
Yeah.
Or are they worth trying to change? Should they be completely thrown out? And how do we stay faithful to scripture in our view of gender roles?
Yeah. So one thing about gender roles is that, Christians, wherever we find ourselves in history, we have a tendency to see whatever our current kind of gender roles are as, God ordained and throughout all of time. And as a historian, when you then look across time and space, you realize that there are all sorts of different kind of, God ordained gender roles. Because in fact, gender roles are human constructs to a large extent. and they reflect the current economic realities. And they change dramatically when those economic conditions change. And so this is something I teach in my women's and gender course. In fact, my students are writing a paper on it tonight. It's due tomorrow. Just tracing how from colonial America to 19th century, ideas of female labor changed significantly. And along with it then female virtue and these God-ordained gender roles and things that, you know, we tend to think of as now Christian gender roles are largely rooted in the Victorian era and not the colonial and not what came before. And so as soon as you understand that, just how much perceptions of gender roles are linked to economic and then political and even issues of foreign policy and how these things change over time, then I think we're much humbler about, you know, speaking confidently into our present moment that any particular arrangement is biblical. Because again, I mean, if history teaches you anything, it's that so much changes over time. And so it just, I think, gives us, it frees us a little bit to ask a different question, which is, what does it mean to be faithful and to be faithful women and men, to be faithful Christians in this particular moment of time? And it might look quite different than what Christians in another time and place had concluded. And it ought to look quite different, I think.
Yeah, another sort of a follow-up question to that, one of the webinar participants asked, what would you say to those who say that God does assign specific gender roles in the Bible?
Well, I think that I'd really want to ask what we're talking about when we talk about gender roles, right? Because there are all different ways that people use that. So there's the question of, you know, authority in the church, right? And so female leadership or not within ecclesiastical contexts, and then there's women belong in the home, and men should lead in all of society, and that's like another layer. But then there's multiple additional layers too. If we start looking at things like biblical womanhood, or what passes for biblical womanhood today, or biblical manhood, and then there's a lot of this cultural baggage that goes on as well. And so there's multiple layers and levels to biblical gender roles. And I think it would really help our conversations if people are very precise about which ones they're talking about, and very critical about what kind of cultural layerings are placed on top of maybe theological arguments, and kind of like start from scratch again. And so there are definitely readings of the scriptures that would lead people to conclude that you know, questions of women's authority in the church, for example. And those are all the passages that Bushnell takes on very masterfully, I would add, and gives us very different readings, and sometimes directly contradictory readings based on what she argues are better translations of the text. So all which to say is, you know, we have to do our theology, and we have to continue to do our theology, and we have to bring in a variety of voices into that theological reflection, right? And one of Bushnell's main arguments, one of her many arguments, was the fact that that women had been excluded from speaking into theology. Women had been excluded from translating the texts for centuries. And that had led to this male bias being worked into the scriptures. And if that sounds really conspiratorial, let me just give you one example that she gave. This was in the 19th century, still had the prairies and, you know, the West. And she said, it's like when a man is driving some oxen in a covered wagon out west and gets lost on the prairie. And he desperately wants to drive straight, right? He wants to drive straight and get out and get to the other side. But he will pull ever so slightly on his dominant hand. Doesn't want to, but he will. And so he ends up going in circles and going in circles. And that's the kind of, you know, analogy that she gave. It's like that, she said. And so we need to bring multiple voices into our biblical translation, our biblical interpretation, not just race, but also gender, it would extend to, nationality, in order that we can really understand as best as we humanly can what is God's word to God's people.
Yeah, so this segues really naturally into another group of questions that I see in the chat. One of the participants says, so I've read many good arguments for an egalitarian view, but I haven't seen as much critique at the level of translation, like you were presenting in Catherine's work. So the participant asked, how did Catherine translate or interpret some of the key texts used to support the patriarchy? And then provides an example, maybe First Timothy, or maybe there's another example that you'd like to grab onto.
Yeah, I mean, she has. In fact, I wrote this book like 6 years ago, so I was just reviewing some of these passages actually because I imagined, and they're really hard to summarize actually because they are so detailed, right? She is going into letter by letter in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew, in the New Testament, in the Greek. She does pay attention to context. But she takes on basically any potential kind of women's passage, it is in here. So let me see if I can find one that can be very succinctly summarized, which is, let's see. First Timothy is kind of a long explanation. Let's see if I can do that, or maybe I can just grab that. Okay, so First Timothy 2:11-15. We can just do a little bit of that. Let a woman learn quietly and with all submissiveness. Right, so Adam was formed first and then Eve, and you know how that goes. First of all, she said men had greatly exaggerated the significance of this passage, and she reminded her readers in this case that Paul was writing a personal letter to Timothy, and so historical context here is very important, and she gives several other examples from that passage where Paul is writing very specific things that only apply in that particular case to Timothy. And then she talks about the nature of inspiration there. And yes, here too, she'll have like several pages where she picks apart each and every passage or each and every kind of word and sentence in that passage. In another one where she talks about in 1 Corinthians, female religious authority, where man is woman's head. She completely reinterprets that and I think has a very compelling revision to that one where it's actually woman is supposed to have power over her own head. And again, she's going word by word here, which when I read that interpretation, it absolutely seems like a more compelling one. She gives many other examples where words like, diakonos are defined as deacon or are translated as deacon when it applies to a man, but as leader when it applies to a woman, and so less the church role, and just has multiple examples of individual words that are translated one way for a man and another way for a woman. And you can just see she gets exasperated as she discovers one after another of these precisely because she cherished the authority of the scriptures so highly that when she saw the way that translators had played fast and loose with the holy words of God, she got really angry at that. So there are just so many examples here from the Old Testament and all of the passages from Paul. By the end, she says Paul's actually a friend of woman. And so she's not trying to get rid of Paul or set Jesus against Paul. She says, rightly understood, he is advocating for the authority of women. And so it's this remarkable work that she does. I ended up including 2.5 chapters in my book, as I said in the talk. Even though I'm a historian, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I needed to give her interpretations kind of the light of day. I needed them to be heard again, because in her own work, like I said, it is meticulous, it is amazing, but it is a slog because she just desperately needed an editor and she didn't have one. And so what I tried to do is just as clearly as possible distill her key teachings. And that's what 2.5 chapters of this book are, even though mostly, I'm a professional historian. So I was, checking in with biblical scholars. Am I getting this Hebrew right? It was a stretch for me. But I thought that's a really important part of her life, her historical context. I wanted that theology to be a part as well.
Mm-hmm. So has her work either directly or indirectly affected any translations of the
It
Bible or
has. It
people's
has.
views?
Yes. So it was her work deeply influenced the work of another woman in the early 20th century, Lee Anna Starr, who wrote The Bible Status of Woman. She was another Methodist woman. And her book was handed to the translation committee of the New Revised Standard version of the scriptures. And since that time, I mean, her book was quietly handed down from woman to woman and sometimes from woman to man. And so Charles Fuller's mother was a huge fan of Bushnell and had a copy of God's Word to Women. And so there's a copy in Fuller's library. And I mean, when you just, once I wrote this, I had so many people contact me. Catherine Bushnell's work has also influenced William Paul Young, if you're familiar with The Shack. And he has another book out on Eve, and he was deeply influenced by Catherine Bushnell's theology. But also indirectly, many of her translations, whether you can trace a direct connection or not, has stood the test of time and have in fact been incorporated in many more recent translations of the scriptures. Yes. So there's the direct influence, and then there's just the, she seems to be right in many of these cases. Her more radical translations have, parts of them have, but like kind of the whole picture. I start my book with her revised narrative of the first chapters of Genesis, which are just breathtaking. And I have not seen yet a Bible that presents it in her kind of her version in its entirety. But it's definitely worth reading, at least just have in the back of your mind the what if this is true instead. Yeah.
Wonderful. So we'll take a step now and talk a little bit about power, and maybe take a step back from Catherine. The question that was posed is, how do we help those with power to realize that they have it, and that historical power norms aren't necessarily part of the creational structure? And there we're using that lovely kind of what Dort holds near and dear, this sense of how God created our structure. How do we help people to realize that? And what do we do with that?
Yeah, I think, so I'm not, I can talk with quite a bit of expertise about the past, but whenever I get these questions about what should we do, I will absolutely say, I will bring what I can as the historian, and then we need the theologians, and we need the psychologists, and we need the whole liberal arts campus here, right? And we need the church. So I'm a huge fan of that. So I kind of bring what I can as a historian, and then I offer it, and then we talk and we work, and we all bring, our disciplinary expertise, really. So yes, huge shout out to liberal arts. But how do we help people to understand that they have power? So as a Calvinist and as somebody who has absolutely embraced kind of Calvinist theology, I think that we always have to be sensitive to the allure of power, and to the fallenness within every human heart, especially our own, right? And so I would say it's very important that we not fool ourselves into believing that we personally or we communally are going to use our power for the good, right? Because everybody who has power ends up convincing themselves of that. And so I think that that's just an important thing to constantly remind ourselves of. Those of us who have some power, those of us who have more power, those of us who are close to people with power, really need to hold each other accountable. And that is not easy to do. And I see this, I observe this in my own life, in our own world, that people who are close to people with more power tend to affirm that so they can participate in that power rather than hold that power accountable. And I would just love to see if Christians could be countercultural in providing a different model. And we haven't always been, right? I think Christians are very prone to saying, oh, but we're going to do really good things with this power, right? We're going to start a really big church. We're going to evangelize. We're going to use our power really well, but there are huge temptations that come in with that mindset. And so I think that there's a kind of cultural change that is needed. I would say also in my own work, I have really benefited from scholarly analysis of power, of understanding how power is exercised in ways that can often be hidden. How gender communicates power in various ways, how power is exercised through cultural products, through kind of coercion, overt, and also just through influence. And so I have training in cultural studies, which is really investigating this. And in some circles, that's viewed very suspiciously as, I don't know, postmodern, or as, not traditional scholarship. I, as a Calvinist, again, very interested in frankly, sin, in how sin, seeps into not just individual hearts, but into our structures. I find an analysis of power can help us to kind of be critical about the reach of the fall through human society as well as through individual interaction. So I actually have benefited from scholarly conversations around the question of power, and I don't take it 100%, and it's not God's truth, but it can help me understand kind of how this world works. And then we can decide, so what should we do instead? But I would love to see Christians be very countercultural in with respect to power, and again, we've largely failed to do so.
Yeah. So I'm keeping my eye on the time, and as we approach the end of our time in the webinar, there's one more question that I think will kind of wrap this up really well. And it's a question that seems to be sort of personal. And this webinar participant wonders, how do you stay encouraged on this particular path that you're on and in your research, in this particular research agenda? When you look at the world around you and you see so many people who want to uphold the patriarchy. How do you do this as a historian and as a woman, and someone who's really interested in the intersection of evangelical Christianity and gender roles?
Yeah. I have to say, I was hopeful in writing this first book, A New Gospel for Women, because I thought, this is new. This could really change things. This could make a difference. And it has made a difference in individual people's lives. And that's been really heartening. I was really discouraged writing Jesus and John Wayne because I just saw how endemic this was, really how corrupted things had become. And as a historian, I knew that there was, that this went so deep, and there was not going to be any quick fix. So much so when I got to the end of the book, my editor said, this is really depressing. Can you give us some hope, Kristin? And I responded to that email. I said, honestly, I don't think I can. I'm really sorry. And then he wrote back again about 3 days later. It's like, no, really, can you just give us something? And that's where I gave him the last sentence of the book, which is, what was once done can also be undone. And I do absolutely believe in that. Again, like so much that passes for, that we are presenting as God's truth is actually a human construction, right? And that if we can understand who was doing what, for what purposes, at what points in time, to what ends, and it was usually, not always, but often to enhance their own power, then we can kind of clear things away and take a fresh look and ask some of these really important questions. And then I will say, I'm not as hopeless now, simply because of so much of the response that I've heard from so many people, that and even one reviewer of Jesus and John Wayne characterized it as, this is a book of love. Underneath everything is a book of love. And that it just absolutely warmed my heart to have it read in that light and heard in that light, and to have so many people embracing it in that way. Honestly, it's been heartening to me to just to know that there is goodness, and there is really people who are seeking truth, and who are looking for a different kind of Christianity and looking to live a different kind of Christian witness. And I think there are many, many of God's people who are really seeking truth. And so I've really found strength in community.
And as we are at the end of our webinar time. Kristin, I want to thank you so much on behalf of Dordt University and the students and the faculty and staff and our community friends who have had a chance to engage with you. First Mondays is all about growing our understanding, stretching our imaginations, helping us to reform, hopefully, God's world around us, and that you've presented us with some really powerful, convicting ideas, helping us to think about who we are as American evangelicals, how we can grow that idea, how we can think more carefully about power. And I think there's a lot of hope there. So thank you for this work, for its richness, and for your spending so much time with us in these talks and in our classes as well.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you all for participating. And I wish you all the best. Again, my years at Dordt were amazing and incredibly formative. And I love to know that the good work at Dordt is continuing. So blessings to you all. And thank you for listening.
And there's lots of applause in our mind's eye. Kristin, until we see you again, which we hope is soon, thank you so very much.
Thank you. Take care.